My name is Anna. I am 14 years old, and not so long ago, my family and I moved to a very unusual place. Have you ever heard anything about Chernobyl? In short, this is a city in the Ukraine, and it is famous for its accident that occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant 34 years ago. As a result of the disaster, there was a huge, powerful release of radioactive substances, and the city was recognized as dangerous. Many people had to be evacuated from there. Dad said that people thought that all this was temporary, and soon they would go back to their homes, which had to be abandoned as a matter of urgency, as well as their belongings, but unfortunately, no one ever returned. And now, more than 30 years have passed, and my fanatical geologist father was still working on some project that he never told my mother and me about. One day, he came home from work and told my mother and I to pack our things. To our questioning look, he only replied that we are moving to Chernobyl. I didn't want this, and neither did my mother, but we both didn't dare say something in spite of my father, because he was a very strict man. Personally, I was always afraid of him. I don't know about my mother. I loved our little house because that's where I was born and raised. I had friends at school and on the street. I liked to go to school, come home after school, eat something delicious, and run outside. I usually did my homework with my mother in the evenings. We hardly saw my father because he was always busy at work. Well, my mother and I were fine with that. When he was at home, we felt tense. I was even afraid to leave the room. In general, my dad is not bad, just did not communicate much with us, and often scolded me or did not pay any attention to me at all. That is why, when he said we were moving, my mother and I kept our indignation and protests to ourselves. Mom silently got up and went to pack her things, and I went to get mine. We left the next morning and took few suitcases with us. We arrived at the place in 3 to 4 days, and it was a terrible road. My father was silent all the way, and my mother and I didn't really talk. We were allowed in with special passes. When we arrived at the place, a sad picture opened up in front of me. In this city, in my city, there were much fewer people. Yes, people still lived there, and there are even working shops, but most of the territory is empty. The houses are very old and ugly. Many of the courtyards have long been overgrown with grass. I was afraid to enter the city. What if we get infected with radiation there? And then what happens? Will I start glowing at night? Or what if I grow a third hand? But my father said it was important to his work, so it wasn't discussed. We were given an apartment in an even more depressing area, where there were no children, no playgrounds, not really anything at all. We went to the apartment and nothing seemed to have changed since the accident. I wanted to cry. My mother and I were left to clean up and sort things out, and my father said it was necessary for him to leave, without even saying where. We scrubbed the apartment for about 4 or 5 hours. All this time, my mother asked me how I was feeling. She was worried about me, but I didn't want to upset her, so I said that everything was fine. In the evening, after dinner, my mother and I decided to take a walk around the area. When we went outside, we saw 2 people. They were also going somewhere. They looked at us and passed us, guns in their hands. It's probably normal to go armed here. After walking around the courtyard, we found a lot of interesting toys and even equipment on the ground. I really wanted to touch something or take it for myself, but my mother wouldn't let me. I asked what would happen to us now, but she said she hoped for the best. Then I saw the children's slides and I wanted a ride. I sat down and went down. I was having fun. The third time, I suddenly heard a terrible roar, and a dog was running at me. She barked and growled horribly, looked at me, and foamed at the mouth. I was going down the hill right into her mouth, and I couldn't slow down. At that moment, my mother rushed towards us, but she was too far away. I already thought I'd lose my head. Suddenly, there was a shot in the air. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the dog was lying dead, and not far away were those men with guns who passed us. This isn't an amusement park. We advise you not to leave the house, but rather to go far away and forever, they told us. My mother grabbed my arm. I thanked them and we ran home. In the evening, my mother began to cry, saying that we would not live like this for long. When my father came home, she first raised the question of whether to leave. Dad didn't like it. He got so tense right away, and I jumped in. I told him that I was almost eaten by a dog, so my father stopped talking and then told us to keep our heads down and go to bed. At this point, I realized that this is for a long time, so I decided to adapt and find ways to survive here. First of all, my mother and I sealed up all the windows, hung a cloth behind them so that no one could see anything, and put tools for self-defense at the entrance, because stray dogs sometimes broke into apartments. Dad said we won't be here for long, but we'll have to stay for a while. A week later, I wanted to go to the station where the explosion took place. That day, my mother also went on business with my father. I didn't want to stay at home, especially since I lived here. Why not see the station with my own eyes? I gathered some warm clothes and went there on the map. It turns out that it was not so easy to get through, since there were security guards and some tourists. But I still managed to get as close as possible in a roundabout way. I took a few photos as a keepsake, and then I saw an interesting doll. She was so beautiful, I wanted to keep her. But security noticed me. They called to me, and I got scared and started running. They quickly caught up with me and began to take away the camera. I resisted, but they were stronger. I was taken to a building and left in an office. It was like an interrogation that I didn't know how to answer. In the end, they shook my mother's phone off of me and called her. My parents were already at home, and my mother was hysterical from not knowing where I was. Anyway, she and Dad came to pick me up, and my dad was so angry. I realized that at home, I would be scolded. "You will leave tomorrow," he said at home. We couldn't believe our ears. I was so happy, and Dad said it was a mistake to bring us along. He added that he thought we were interested in his work, but this was not the case. To be honest, I didn't care, so I just went and started packing. We left the next day, and Dad still stayed. All I knew was that I would never go back there again. Would you like to visit Chernobyl?